Why don't you? This is a frequently asked question in English. It is used when we want to give some suggestion to someone in an informal way. After why don't you, we use base form of the verb and other words. Examples. Why don't you come to my place? Why don't you sit here? Why don't you buy a sweater? Why don't you eat something? Why don't you take a cup of tea? Why don't you lend him some money? Why don't you ask your parents? Why don't you go regularly? Why don't you practice daily? Why don't you consult a doctor? Why don't you see a cardiologist? Why don't you reduce your weight? Why don't you do exercise? Why don't you talk frankly? Why don't you wear formal dress? Why don't you open the windows? Why don't you explain it? Why don't you try again? Why don't you join politics? Why don't you reveal the truth? Why don't you spend some time with us? Why don't you clear the debts? Why don't you send your son to us? Why don't you sell this car? Why don't you buy a new car? Why don't you wash the curtains? Why don't you plant some trees? Why don't you take loan? Why don't you host a party? Why don't you open the gates? So, why don't is used when you are giving some suggestion or advice to somebody. This is used mostly in the flow of conversation. Keep making own examples. Why don't you read these examples loudly? Why don't you listen to these examples? And why don't you make some own sentences? Thank you and have a great time.